Picture this. A relatively unknown Chicago theater actor walks onto a movie set in 1993 not knowing that the next few months of filming would completely rewrite the story of his life. Gary Sinise thought he was just taking another acting job when he agreed to play Lieutenant Dan Taylor in Forrest Gump. He had no idea that pretending to be a wounded Vietnam War veteran would ignite a passion so fierce it would consume the next 3 decades of his life.
What started as a few scenes in a Tom Hanks movie became a lifelong mission that would see Gary Sinise personally help thousands of wounded veterans, build homes for disabled soldiers, entertain troops in war zones around the world, and create a foundation that would change lives on a scale most people only dream about. The man who once struggled to pay his rent in Chicago would eventually be called to the White House, honored by presidents, and recognized as one of America's greatest advocates for military families. But the most remarkable part of this story isn't the fame or recognition Gary received. It's how completely and authentically he transformed from an actor playing a role into a real-life hero whose impact extends far beyond anything Hollywood could ever create. This is the extraordinary, true story of how one character changed not just an actor's career, but rewrote the entire purpose of his existence.
Gary Sinise was running late for what would become the most important phone call of his life.
It was early 1993, and he was rushing between rehearsals at his beloved Steppenwolf Theater Company in Chicago when his agent finally managed to reach him. The call was about a movie role, and Gary almost didn't take it seriously. He had been grinding it out in Chicago theater for over 2 decades, surviving on small paychecks and big dreams, rarely venturing into Hollywood's unpredictable waters. The voice on the other end was excited, almost breathless. There was a part in an upcoming Tom Hanks movie, something called Forrest Gump, and the director wanted to meet with Gary about playing a character named Lieutenant Dan Taylor. Gary had heard of the project vaguely, knew it was based on a novel, but honestly hadn't given it much thought. His world was the stage, not the screen, and he was perfectly content building something meaningful with his theater company, rather than chasing the lottery ticket dreams of movie stardom. But there was something in his agent's voice that made Gary pause. This wasn't just another casting call. Robert Zemeckis, the director, had specifically asked for Gary Sinise. Someone had recommended him, though Gary couldn't figure out who or why. He wasn't exactly a household name, and his film experience was limited to a handful of smaller projects. Most people in Hollywood probably couldn't pronounce his last name correctly, let alone pick him out of a lineup. Gary's life at that point was a study in dedication over recognition. He had co-founded Steppenwolf Theater Company back in 1974 with a group of passionate young actors who believed theater could change the world. They had started in a church basement in Highland Park, Illinois, with more enthusiasm than money, putting on plays for audiences of 20 or 30 people who were brave enough to venture into their makeshift space.
Over the years, they had built something special, a theater company that was gaining national recognition for raw, powerful performances that stripped away Hollywood glamour and got to the heart of human experience. The work was fulfilling but financially challenging.
Gary often worked multiple jobs to keep the theater afloat and support his growing family. He had married Moira Harris, a fellow actor, and they were raising their children in a modest home, living paycheck to paycheck like most artists who chose passion over financial security.
Gary drove an old car, wore clothes until they fell apart, and poured every spare dollar back into the theater. He wasn't complaining, he was living his dream. But there were months when keeping the lights on at Steppenwolf required creative financing and a lot of prayer. When Gary finally made it to Los Angeles for the meeting with Robert Zemeckis, he felt completely out of place. The director's office was everything Gary expected from Hollywood, polished and professional in a way that made his theater world seem quaint by comparison. But Zemeckis was different from what Gary had imagined. He was thoughtful, interested in Gary's theater background, and most importantly, he seemed to understand something about the character of Lieutenant Dan that went deeper than the script. Zemeckis explained that Lieutenant Dan Taylor was a career military officer who loses his legs in Vietnam and struggles with anger, depression, and a crisis of faith. The character starts the movie as Forrest Gump's commanding officer, someone who believes deeply in honor, duty, and the military way of life. But after his injury, he becomes bitter and lost, questioning everything he once held sacred. It was a complex role that required an actor who could show both strength and vulnerability, someone who could make the audience believe in both the officer's initial confidence and his later despair. Gary found himself drawn into the conversation in a way he hadn't expected. He began asking questions about Lieutenant Dan's background, his family history, his military service record. What kind of man was he before Vietnam? What dreams did he have? What did honor mean to him? Zemeckis was impressed by Gary's curiosity and his instinct to build a complete character rather than just hit the obvious emotional notes. The director explained that this wasn't going to be a typical war movie. Forrest Gump was telling a much larger story about American life and history, with the Vietnam War as just one chapter in a sweeping narrative. Lieutenant Dan's journey from confident officer to broken veteran to eventual redemption was meant to represent something larger about how America itself had been wounded and needed to heal. Gary understood immediately that this was more than just a supporting role in a Tom Hanks vehicle. This was an opportunity to explore something meaningful about service, sacrifice, and recovery. But even as Gary felt excited about the artistic possibilities, he was practical about his chances. This was a major studio picture with a big-name star. There would be dozens of established movie actors competing for the role, people with recognizable faces and proven box office appeal. Gary was a theater guy from Chicago who looked like a regular person, rather than a Hollywood leading man. His resume was filled with stage credits that meant nothing to movie executives and small films that few people had seen. Gary left the meeting uncertain but intrigued. He flew back to Chicago and tried to put the audition out of his mind, focusing on the Steppenwolf production that was currently consuming his attention. But he found himself thinking about Lieutenant Dan at odd moments, imagining how he would approach the character's emotional journey. There was something about the role that felt personal, though Gary couldn't quite identify what it was at the time. Weeks passed without word from Hollywood. Gary assumed that meant he was out of the running, which was fine with him. He had a play to direct and actors to mentor, and Steppenwolf was in the middle of planning their next season. The theater was his real world, and movie auditions were just occasional diversions that rarely led anywhere significant. Then his agent called with news that would change everything. Gary Sinise had been cast as Lieutenant Dan Taylor in Forrest Gump. Robert Zemeckis had chosen the Chicago theater actor over dozens of more famous candidates because he saw something authentic in Gary's approach to the character. The director believed Gary could bring both the military bearing and the emotional depth that the role required, and he was willing to bet a significant portion of his movie budget on that instinct. Gary's first reaction was excitement, followed quickly by terror. This was Tom Hanks, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, in a major studio production with a substantial budget. Gary would be working with the kind of resources he had never experienced, surrounded by professional crew members who had made dozens of successful films. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but it was also completely outside his comfort zone. As he prepared to leave Chicago for several months of filming, Gary had no idea that he was about to begin a journey that would transform not just his career, but his entire understanding of his purpose in life. He thought he was simply taking a good acting job that would provide financial security for his family and maybe open some doors for future projects. He had no way of knowing that Lieutenant Dan Taylor was about to become more than just a character he played. The role would become a calling that would define the rest of his life and touch the lives of thousands of people he had never met. The last night before leaving for the film set, Gary sat in the empty Steppenwolf Theater where he had spent so many years honing his craft. He looked around at the simple stage and modest seating, thinking about all the stories they had told in that space and all the lives they had touched through their work. He felt grateful for everything theater had given him, but also sensed that he was about to embark on something completely different. He just had no idea how completely different it would turn out to be. Gary Sinise was about to discover that sometimes the most important roles an actor plays are not the ones they perform on stage or screen, but the ones they choose to live in real life. Lieutenant Dan Taylor was going to teach Gary lessons about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to use his talents to make a difference in the world. The struggling theater actor from Chicago was about to become something he never expected, a voice for America's wounded warriors, and a living example of how one person's commitment can change countless lives. The transformation began the moment Gary Sinise stepped onto the Forrest Gump set. Everything about the production was bigger, more complex, and more meticulously planned than anything he had experienced in his theater world. But what struck Gary most profoundly was not the Hollywood machinery surrounding him, but the weight of responsibility he felt toward the character he was about to portray. Gary understood that Lieutenant Dan Taylor was not just a fictional character. He represented thousands of real veterans who had returned from Vietnam wounded, angry, and struggling to find their place in a society that seemed to have moved on without them. Gary had grown up during the Vietnam era, and he remembered the controversial homecomings, the protests, and the way many veterans were treated with indifference or even hostility. Playing Lieutenant Dan meant honoring their experience and telling their story with the respect and authenticity it deserved. To prepare for the role, Gary immersed himself in research about the Vietnam War and its aftermath. He read military histories, personal memoirs, and medical journals about combat injuries and amputation. He visited Veterans Administration hospitals and spoke with doctors, nurses, and social workers who worked with disabled veterans. Most importantly, he began meeting with Vietnam veterans who had lost limbs in combat, listening to their stories and learning about the physical and emotional challenges they faced.
These conversations changed Gary in ways he had not anticipated. He met men who had been teenagers when they were drafted or enlisted, kids from small towns and big cities who had gone to Vietnam believing in their mission and their country. They had served with courage and honor, often under incredibly difficult circumstances, and many had paid a terrible price for their service. But what struck Gary most was not their bitterness, though some certainly felt that, but their resilience and their continued love of country despite everything they had endured.
One veteran Gary met had lost both legs to a landmine and spent 2 years in military hospitals learning to walk again. He told Gary about the rage he felt when he first realized the extent of his injuries, how he had cursed God and country and everyone who tried to help him.
But he also talked about the gradual process of rebuilding his life, finding new purpose and discovering that his value as a human being was not diminished by his physical limitations. His story became a template for Gary's understanding of Lieutenant Dan's emotional journey.
Another veteran shared his experience of coming home to a country that seemed to want to forget the war had ever happened. People didn't know what to say to him, so they often said nothing at all.
He felt invisible, forgotten, and abandoned by the very society he had served. Gary realized that Lieutenant Dan's anger was not just about his personal injuries, but about feeling discarded and unappreciated by his country.
The character's journey toward healing would have to address both the physical and emotional wounds of war. Gary also began learning about the technical aspects of portraying a double amputee. The film's special effects team, led by Industrial Light and Magic, was developing groundbreaking techniques to digitally remove Gary's legs in post-production. But Gary needed to understand how a person with prosthetic legs would move, sit, and navigate the world. He worked with physical therapists and amputee consultants who taught him about the realities of living with artificial limbs. The physical preparation was challenging and sometimes painful. Gary had to learn to walk with prosthetic legs for the scenes where Lieutenant Dan has adapted to his new reality. The prosthetics were heavy and uncomfortable, and learning to move naturally while wearing them required hours of practice. Gary also had to master the art of moving in a wheelchair, understanding that Lieutenant Dan would use it not just for transportation but as a symbol of his independence and stubborn refusal to be pitied. But the emotional preparation was even more demanding. Gary had to find Lieutenant Dan's rage without letting it consume him, and then trace the character's path toward acceptance and renewal. The script gave him the basic framework, but Gary knew he needed to understand the psychology of trauma and recovery to make the performance authentic. He read extensively about post-traumatic stress disorder, survivor guilt, and the grieving process that follows life-changing injuries. Gary discovered that many veterans went through predictable stages after losing limbs in combat. One of those is a tested moment with the death of a person in the Pocket's car. First came denial, the inability to accept the permanence of their condition, then anger, often directed at military leaders, politicians, God, or themselves. Depression followed, sometimes lasting for years, as veterans struggled to reimagine their lives and their identities. Finally, for those fortunate enough to complete the journey, came acceptance and the possibility of finding new meaning and purpose. Lieutenant Dan's arc in the movie compressed this psychological journey into a series of dramatic scenes, but Gary wanted to make sure each stage felt real and earned. He spent time with veterans who had successfully navigated this difficult process, learning how they had found the strength to rebuild their lives. Many talked about the importance of finding new ways to serve, whether through helping other veterans, working with charitable organizations, or simply being present for their families in ways they had not been able to do before their injuries. As filming began, Gary found himself drawing on these real-life stories to inform his performance. When Lieutenant Dan first appears on screen as Forrest's commanding officer, Gary played him with the confidence and competence of a career military man who believed deeply in his mission. The character was someone who had found his identity through service and leadership, and Gary made sure that strength came through even in Lieutenant Dan's lighter moments with his men. The scenes depicting Lieutenant Dan's injury and immediate aftermath were emotionally brutal to film. Gary had to portray the raw shock and disbelief of someone whose entire identity had been shattered in an instant. He drew on the stories of veterans who had described that moment of realization when they understood their lives would never be the same. The challenge was showing Lieutenant Dan's devastation without making him simply pathetic or one-dimensional. Gary's theater background served him well during these intense emotional scenes. Years of live performance had taught him how to access deep emotions and sustain them through multiple takes and technical interruptions. But this felt different from anything he had done on stage.
He was not just playing a character, he was representing real people who had experienced unimaginable trauma. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and terrifying. Tom Hanks proved to be an ideal scene partner for these challenging moments. Hanks understood the importance of what Gary was trying to achieve with Lieutenant Dan, and he helped create an atmosphere on set that was both professional and emotionally supportive. The scenes between Forrest and Lieutenant Dan required a delicate balance of humor and pathos, and Hanks's instinctive generosity as an actor made Gary's job easier. Director Robert Zemeckis encouraged Gary to explore the full range of Lieutenant Dan's emotional journey, even in scenes that might be uncomfortable for audiences.
Zemeckis understood that the character's healing process could not be rushed or simplified, and he gave Gary the freedom to show Lieutenant Dan's darkest moments without worrying about making him likable. This creative support allowed Gary to portray the character's struggle with complete honesty.
As filming progressed, Gary began to feel a growing connection to the military community that went beyond his research and preparation. Veterans who visited the set were moved by his commitment to telling their story accurately, and many shared personal experiences that further informed his performance.
Gary realized he was becoming more than just an actor playing a role. He was becoming an advocate for people whose experiences had been overlooked or misunderstood by mainstream society. The famous ice cream scene, where Lieutenant Dan finally makes peace with God and his circumstances during a storm at sea, was filmed over several days in challenging conditions. Gary had to convey Lieutenant Dan's spiritual breakthrough while being battered by wind machines and artificial rain. But the physical discomfort seemed appropriate for the emotional content of the scene. Gary was portraying a man who had wrestled with the deepest questions of faith and meaning and finally found a kind of peace. Gary began to understand that Lieutenant Dan's journey was not just about overcoming disability, but about discovering new ways to serve and finding purpose after trauma. The character's evolution from bitter veteran to successful businessman to supportive friend represented a kind of resurrection that many real veterans had experienced in their own lives. Gary felt honored to be telling this story and increasingly aware that his performance might influence how audiences thought about veterans and their sacrifices. By the time filming wrapped, Gary Sinise had been fundamentally changed by his experience playing Lieutenant Dan Taylor. He had gained a deep appreciation for the military community and an understanding of the challenges faced by wounded veterans. More importantly, he had discovered a passion for advocacy that would soon become central to his life's work. Gary thought he had been hired to play a supporting role in a Tom Hanks movie, but Lieutenant Dan had taught him lessons about service, sacrifice, and resilience that would reshape his entire future. The actor who returned to Chicago after filming Forrest Gump was different from the one who had left months earlier. Gary Sinise had found his life's calling, though he didn't fully realize it yet. Lieutenant Dan Taylor was no longer just a character he had played. The role had become a doorway to a new understanding of what it meant to use his talents in service of something larger than himself. When Forrest Gump opened in theaters on July 6, 1994, Gary Sinise had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had returned to Chicago after filming, thrown himself back into his work at Steppenwolf Theater, and tried to maintain some normalcy while waiting to see how audiences would respond to the movie. Gary had been in enough productions to know that you never could predict which projects would connect with the public, so he kept his expectations modest and his focus on his theater work. But from the very first screenings, it became clear that Forrest Gump was going to be something special. Audiences were not just entertained by the movie, they were deeply moved by it. And Lieutenant Dan Taylor, the bitter veteran who finds redemption through friendship and perseverance, struck a chord that surprised everyone involved with the production. Gary began receiving letters from veterans and their families, thanking him for portraying their experiences with dignity and authenticity. The first letter that really affected Gary came from a Vietnam veteran in Texas who had lost his legs in 1969. The man wrote that he had avoided all Vietnam movies for decades because they either glorified war or depicted veterans as damaged and dangerous. But Lieutenant Dan was different. The character's journey from anger to acceptance felt real to him, and for the first time since returning from Vietnam, he felt like someone in Hollywood understood what he and his fellow veterans had experienced. More letters followed, each one carrying a personal story of service, sacrifice, and survival. Gary read about young men who had been drafted out of high school and returned home to face indifference or hostility. He learned about families torn apart by the invisible wounds of war. and about veterans who had spent decades trying to find their place in a society that seemed to have moved on without them. But he also read about resilience, about men and women who had rebuilt their lives after unimaginable trauma, and about the bonds of brotherhood that sustained them through their darkest moments. What struck Gary most powerfully was how many of these letter writers saw Lieutenant Dan not as a fictional character, but as someone who represented their own experiences. They thanked Gary not just for his performance, but for helping to tell their stories to a wider audience. Many mentioned that their families and friends had watched the movie and finally begun to understand something about what they had been through. Lieutenant Dan had become a bridge between the veteran community and civilian society, helping people have conversations that had been avoided for decades. Gary realized that his portrayal of Lieutenant Dan had given him a unique platform and an unexpected responsibility. Veterans saw him as someone who understood their experiences and could speak for them in ways they often could not speak for themselves. This was not something Gary had anticipated when he took the role, but it was becoming increasingly important to him. He began to see that his work as an actor could serve a purpose beyond entertainment. The movie's success also brought Gary into contact with military and veteran organizations that were eager to connect with someone who had portrayed their experiences so authentically. Gary was invited to speak at veteran events, visit military hospitals, and participate in ceremonies honoring wounded warriors. Each of these experiences deepened his understanding of military culture and strengthened his commitment to serving this community. Gary's first visit to a Veterans Administration medical center was both humbling and inspiring. He met young soldiers who had been wounded in training accidents, older veterans dealing with service-connected disabilities, and family members who were struggling to care for loved ones with traumatic brain injuries. Many of these people recognized him from the movie and wanted to share their own stories. Gary listened to each one, understanding that he was being trusted with experiences that were often too painful or complex to share with civilians who had never served. One encounter that particularly affected Gary involved a young soldier who had lost both legs in a training exercise. The soldier's wife was struggling to care for him while raising two small children, and the family was facing financial difficulties because of medical expenses not covered by military benefits. Gary realized that while Lieutenant Dan's story had a Hollywood ending, many real veterans and their families continued to struggle with challenges that were both practical and profound. Gary began to educate himself about the issues facing contemporary veterans and their families. He learned about gaps in medical care, problems with disability benefits, and the challenges veterans faced when transitioning from military service to civilian careers. He discovered that while the country had learned to honor veterans publicly, many were still struggling privately with problems that could be solved with adequate resources and attention. This education process led Gary to begin supporting veteran organizations financially and through personal appearances. He started small, writing checks to help individual veterans with immediate needs, and appearing at fundraising events for established charities. But as his involvement deepened, Gary began to see patterns in the problems veterans faced and opportunities for more systematic solutions. The success of Forrest Gump also brought Gary opportunities to work on other military-themed projects. Television producers and movie studios wanted him to play more military characters, recognizing that audiences associated him with authentic portrayals of military life. Gary was selective about these opportunities, choosing projects that would allow him to continue telling stories about service and sacrifice in respectful and meaningful ways. One significant project was the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, where Gary played a small role but also served as an executive producer. Working on this World War II epic allowed Gary to work with real veterans from that conflict and to help ensure that their stories were told with the accuracy and reverence they deserved. The experience reinforced Gary's belief that entertainment could serve an important function in educating the public about military history and honoring those who had served. But Gary's most significant post-Forrest Gump project was not in entertainment at all. In 2003, he was invited to travel to Iraq with the United Service Organizations to perform for American troops deployed in combat zones. This first USO tour was a revelation for Gary. He saw firsthand the conditions under which American service members were operating, and he witnessed their dedication, professionalism, and sacrifice. The soldiers Gary met in Iraq were dealing with challenges that went far beyond anything he had researched for Lieutenant Dan. They were serving multiple combat deployments, dealing with improvised explosive devices and suicide bombers, and trying to maintain morale while being separated from their families for months or years at a time. Yet Gary was struck by their positive attitude and their commitment to their mission and to each other. During that first Iraq tour,
Gary performed with his band, the Lieutenant Dan Band, which he had formed to honor veterans and active-duty military personnel. The concerts were informal affairs, often performed on makeshift stages in dangerous locations, but the response from the troops was overwhelming. Gary realized that his presence meant something to these service members that went beyond entertainment. He represented a connection to home and a recognition of their service that many felt they were not receiving from the broader American public. Gary returned from Iraq with a new understanding of his role and his responsibilities.
He had seen the face of contemporary military service, and he understood that Lieutenant Dan's story was being lived out in new ways by a new generation of warriors. The character that had changed Gary's career was now guiding him toward a new mission that would define the rest of his life.
The transformation was gradual but profound. Gary continued his acting career, but increasingly he saw it as a platform for something larger.
Every role, every interview, every public appearance became an opportunity to advocate for military families and to raise awareness about the challenges facing veterans. Gary was becoming more than an actor who had played a memorable military character. He was becoming a voice for the military community and a bridge between civilian and military America.
Gary's family supported this evolution in his career and his calling, even though it meant spending more time away from home and taking on responsibilities that went far beyond traditional celebrity advocacy. His wife, Moira, understood that Gary had found something that gave his work deeper meaning, and she encouraged him to follow this path wherever it might lead.
By 2004, Gary Sinise had traveled to combat zones multiple times, performed for thousands of troops, and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for military charities. But he was just getting started.
Lieutenant Dan had introduced Gary to a world of service and sacrifice that demanded nothing less than his complete commitment. The character that had once been just a role in a movie had become Gary's guide to a new understanding of what it meant to use his gifts in service of others.
Gary was beginning to realize that his greatest performance would not be on any stage or screen, but in the real-world role he was creating for himself as an advocate, supporter, and friend to America's military families.
Lieutenant Dan Taylor had taught Gary about resilience and redemption, and now Gary was going to spend the rest of his life applying those lessons in ways that would touch thousands of real lives.
By 2005, Gary Sinise had performed for troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait, and numerous military bases around the world. What started as occasional USO tours had evolved into a regular commitment that was reshaping how Gary viewed his career and his purpose. The Lieutenant Dan Band was becoming famous in military circles, and Gary was receiving invitations to perform at military events almost every week. But as his involvement with the military community deepened, Gary began to see needs that went far beyond entertainment and morale-boosting concerts. The letters Gary received from military families had evolved from simple thank you notes to detailed accounts of struggles that kept him awake at night.
He read about military spouses trying to manage households alone while their partners deployed repeatedly to combat zones.
He learned about children who barely knew their military parents because of extended deployments.
Most heartbreaking of all, he heard from families dealing with service members who had been wounded in ways that would affect the rest of their lives. One story that particularly haunted Gary came from a military wife whose husband had lost both legs and suffered traumatic brain injury from an improvised explosive device in Iraq. The soldier was receiving excellent medical care, but the family was struggling with basic needs, like housing modifications, transportation, and child care, while the wife spent long hours at the medical center.
The woman wrote that she felt forgotten by a country that claimed to support the troops but seemed unaware of the practical challenges facing military families dealing with severe combat injuries. Gary began to understand that while Americans had learned to say thank you for your service, many had little understanding of what that service actually cost military families. The gap between public support and private reality was enormous, and Gary felt compelled to do something about it. He started by helping individual families with immediate needs, writing personal checks to help with rent, utilities, and medical expenses not covered by military benefits. But Gary quickly realized that individual assistance, while important, was not going to address the systematic problems he was seeing. Military families needed sustained support, advocacy, and resources that went far beyond what any individual celebrity could provide. Gary began researching existing military charities to understand how he could best contribute to solutions rather than just treating symptoms. What Gary discovered was both encouraging and frustrating.
There were many excellent organizations working to support military families, but coordination between them was often poor, and many were struggling with limited resources and public awareness. Gary also found that some military charities were more focused on fundraising and publicity than on actually helping military families.
He began to envision a different approach, one that would focus relentlessly on impact and accountability. The idea for the Gary Sinise Foundation began to take shape during a 2008 visit to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where Gary met dozens of service members who had been wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan.
These young men and women were receiving world-class medical care, but Gary could see that their needs went far beyond healing their physical injuries. They needed hope, purpose, and practical support as they rebuilt their lives around new realities. One conversation that crystallized Gary's thinking involved a Marine sergeant who had lost both legs and suffered burns over much of his body in an IED explosion. The Marine was facing a long rehabilitation process and an uncertain future, but what struck Gary most was the man's determination to find ways to continue serving his country and his fellow Marines.
The sergeant talked about wanting to help other wounded warriors navigate the challenges he was facing, but he needed resources and support to make that vision a reality. Gary realized that wounded veterans like this Marine represented an incredible untapped resource for helping others in similar situations.
They understood the challenges of combat injury and recovery in ways that civilian supporters, no matter how well-intentioned, simply could not. Gary began to envision programs that would harness the experience and dedication of wounded veterans to help others while providing meaningful purpose for their own lives.
In 2011, Gary officially launched the Gary Sinise Foundation with a mission to serve and honor America's defenders, veterans, first responders, and their families. But this was not going to be a typical celebrity charity that existed primarily to enhance the founder's public image.
Gary was determined to build an organization that would be measured by its impact on the lives of the people it served, not by the publicity it generated or the funds it raised. The foundation's first major initiative was the RISEA program, which stood for Restoring Independence and Supporting Empowerment. The program was designed to build specially adapted smart homes for severely wounded veterans, providing them with living environments that accommodated their injuries while promoting independence and dignity.
Gary had visited too many wounded veterans living in homes that were not equipped for their disabilities, forcing them to depend on family members for basic tasks and limiting their ability to rebuild their lives. The first RICA home was built for Army Staff Sergeant John Kreisel, who had lost both legs in Iraq and was struggling to navigate his family's two-story home. Gary worked with architects and contractors to design a house that would allow John to move freely, care for his children, and maintain his independence while accommodating his prosthetic legs and wheelchair. The project took months of planning and hundreds of thousands of dollars, but when John and his family moved into their new home, Gary knew he had found his true calling. The impact of that first smart home went far beyond providing shelter for one family.
John Kreisel became an advocate and motivational speaker, using his new independence to help other wounded veterans. His wife was able to return to work, knowing that John could safely care for their children and manage their household. Their children had a father who was fully present and engaged in their lives, rather than limited by an environment that emphasized his disabilities rather than his capabilities. Gary understood that building smart homes was expensive and time-consuming, but he also saw that the investment paid dividends that went far beyond the immediate beneficiaries. Wounded veterans who received these homes often became leaders in their communities, advocates for other veterans, and examples of resilience that inspired everyone around them.
Gary was not just providing housing. He was investing in human potential and creating multiplier effects that would benefit countless others. The Foundation's second major initiative was the Relief and Resiliency Program, which provided emergency financial assistance to military families facing unexpected hardships. Gary had learned that military families often live paycheck to paycheck, and that unexpected expenses related to deployments, injuries, or family emergencies could quickly create financial crises. The program was designed to provide immediate assistance while connecting families with longer-term resources and support. Gary insisted that the Relief and Resiliency Program operate with minimal bureaucracy and maximum speed. Military families in crisis needed help within days, not weeks or months. The Foundation developed streamlined application processes and empowered staff to make quick decisions about assistance. Gary wanted military families to experience the same rapid response they provided when their country called on them to serve. The Foundation also expanded Gary's entertainment work through the Soaring Valor program, which brought World War II veterans to Washington, D.C., to visit the memorials built in their honor. Gary had been moved by the stories of elderly veterans who had never had the opportunity to see the monuments celebrating their service and sacrifice.
Many of these men were in failing health and facing financial constraints that made travel difficult. The program covered all expenses and provided medical support to ensure that veterans could make the trip safely and comfortably. Gary often accompanied these honor flights personally,
spending time with veterans and listening to their stories about the war and its aftermath. These conversations deepened his understanding of military history and strengthened his resolve to ensure that contemporary veterans received better support than previous generations had experienced. The World War II veterans became mentors and inspiration for Gary's work with younger veterans, providing perspective on how military service connected different generations of Americans. Each program the foundation developed was designed with input from the military community it was intended to serve. Gary insisted that wounded veterans, military spouses, and veteran service organizations play central roles in program design and evaluation. He understood that good intentions were not enough. The Foundation's programs had to address real needs in ways that were respectful and effective. Gary also maintained his USO touring, but now these performances served multiple purposes. They provided morale and entertainment for deployed troops, but they also allowed Gary to stay connected with active-duty military members and to understand their evolving needs and challenges. The Lieutenant Bear, Dan Band concerts became venues for announcing new Foundation programs and connecting with military families who might benefit from Foundation services. The Foundation's growth was rapid and dramatic.
Within 5 years of its launch, Gary Sinise Foundation was operating in all 50 states and had served thousands of military families. The organization had built dozens of smart homes, provided millions of dollars in emergency financial assistance, and honored thousands of World War II veterans through the Soaring Valor program.
But Gary measured success not by these impressive statistics, but by individual stories of lives changed and potential realized. One story that exemplified the Foundation's impact involved Army Captain Luis Avila, who had lost both legs and suffered traumatic brain injury in Afghanistan. Luis received one of the Foundation's smart homes, which allowed him to live independently and care for his young daughter. The home's adaptive technology helped Luis manage the effects of his brain injury, while its accessibility features accommodated his prosthetic legs. With his housing situation stabilized, Luis was able to focus on his rehabilitation and eventually returned to college to study engineering. Luis's story became a template for how the Foundation's comprehensive approach could transform lives. The smart home provided the physical foundation for independence, but the Foundation also connected Luis with educational resources, career counseling, and a network of other wounded veterans who had successfully navigated similar challenges. Luis eventually became a volunteer with the Foundation, using his experience to help other wounded veterans and their families.
Gary realized that Lieutenant Dan's fictional journey from wounded warrior to successful civilian was being replicated in real life by the veterans his foundation served. The character that had changed Gary's career was now providing a roadmap for helping actual wounded veterans rebuild their lives with dignity, purpose, and hope.
The Foundation was not just providing services. It was helping to write new chapters in the ongoing American story of service, sacrifice, and resilience. As Gary Sinise entered his 70s, he could look back on a transformation that seemed almost impossible to believe. The struggling Chicago theater actor who had once worried about paying rent had become one of America's most respected advocates for military families. A man whose foundation had touched tens of thousands of lives and whose personal commitment to service had inspired countless others to get involved in supporting veterans. The numbers told part of the story, but only part. By 2023, the Gary Sinise Foundation had built more than 100 specially adapted smart homes for severely wounded veterans. The Relief and Resiliency Program had provided over $20 million in emergency financial assistance to military families facing crises.
The Soaring Valor program had honored more than 10,000 World War II veterans with trips to see the memorials built in their honor.
The Lieutenant Dan Band had performed more than 500 concerts for military audiences around the world, often in dangerous locations where few entertainers were willing to go. But the real measure of Gary's impact could not be captured in statistics. It lived in the stories of individual families whose lives had been transformed by his foundation's work, in the wounded veterans who had found new purpose and independence, and in the ripple effects that spread far beyond any single program or initiative. Take the story of Marine Corporal Todd Love, who had lost both legs and suffered severe burns in an IED explosion in Afghanistan. Todd received one of the Foundation's smart homes in 2018, a specially designed house that accommodated his disabilities while allowing him to live independently and care for his young son. The home featured voice-activated lighting and temperature controls, accessible bathrooms and kitchen facilities, and a workshop where Todd could pursue his interest in woodworking. The smart home gave Todd more than just a place to live. It gave him back his role as a father and provider. He was able to care for his son without assistance, pursue a college degree in business administration, and start a small woodworking business that employed other disabled veterans.
Todd's success inspired his neighbors and community members to become more involved in supporting local veterans, creating a network of support that extended far beyond what the foundation had initially provided. Stories like Todd's multiplied across the country as the foundation's programs matured and expanded. Gary began to see that his organization was not just helping individual families but was contributing to a broader cultural shift in how America understood and supported military service.
The Foundation's work was helping to bridge the gap between civilian and military America, creating connections and understanding that had been missing since the end of the draft. Gary's own role had evolved as well.
While he continued to act and perform, his primary identity had shifted from entertainer to advocate. He spent more time visiting military hospitals than movie sets, more time planning foundation programs than rehearsing scripts. The transformation had been gradual but complete, and Gary had no regrets about the path his life had taken. The foundation's success had also attracted the attention of government leaders and policymakers who recognized Gary as a credible voice on military and veteran issues. He testified before Congress about gaps in veteran services, advised government agencies on program development, and worked with other advocacy organizations to push for policy changes that would benefit military families. Gary's Hollywood background made him an effective communicator, but his deep knowledge of military issues and his obvious personal commitment gave him credibility that went far beyond celebrity advocacy.
One of Gary's most significant policy victories involved advocating for improved mental health services for veterans. Gary had seen too many service members struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other invisible wounds of war. He used his platform to raise awareness about military suicide rates and to push for better funding and access to mental health care. Gary's advocacy helped secure additional resources for veteran mental health programs and reduced some of the stigma around seeking help for psychological injuries. Gary also became a vocal advocate for military families, highlighting the challenges faced by military spouses and children who sacrificed alongside their service members. He pushed for better support for military families during deployments, improved educational opportunities for military children, and career development programs for military spouses whose careers were often disrupted by frequent moves and deployments. Gary understood that military service was a family commitment, and he worked to ensure that the entire military family received appropriate recognition and support. The Foundation's work during the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both its flexibility and its commitment to the military community. When lockdowns and social distancing measures threatened to isolate elderly veterans, the Foundation quickly developed new programs to provide virtual companionship and support. When military families faced unexpected financial hardships due to pandemic-related job losses, the Foundation expanded its emergency assistance programs. Gary personally participated in virtual concerts and events to maintain morale and connection with the military community during a time of unprecedented isolation. Gary's commitment to military families also extended to first responders, recognizing the similarities between military service and the work done by police officers, firefighters, and emergency medical personnel. The Foundation developed programs specifically for first responders and their families, acknowledging that these civilian servants faced many of the same challenges and risks as their military counterparts. Gary understood that service took many forms, and his Foundation's mission expanded to honor all those who put themselves at risk to protect others. The Foundation's success had created opportunities for Gary to influence other celebrities and public figures to become more involved in military advocacy. Gary became a mentor and advisor to other entertainers who wanted to support military causes, helping them understand how to contribute effectively without exploiting their relationship with the military community for personal gain. Gary's example showed that celebrity advocacy could be both authentic and impactful when it was based on genuine commitment rather than publicity seeking. As Gary reflected on the decades that had passed since he first portrayed Lieutenant Dan Taylor, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this point. The character that had seemed like just another acting job had become the defining influence of his life, shaping his priorities, his relationships, and his understanding of what it meant to serve others. Gary often said that Lieutenant Dan had taught him more about life than any other role he had ever played, and that the lessons continued to guide him every day. Gary's family had been transformed by this journey as well. His children had grown up understanding that their father's work was about more than entertainment, and they had chosen to become involved in the Foundation's mission in their own ways.
Gary's marriage had been strengthened by sharing a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success or financial security. The Sinise family had become a military family in spirit, if not in fact, connected to a community of service members and veterans who had become extended family. Looking toward the future, Gary saw no end to the need for advocacy and support for military families. New conflicts would create new generations of veterans with new needs and challenges. Technology would create new opportunities to serve and new ways to connect with military families.
The foundation would need to continue evolving and adapting to meet changing needs while maintaining its core commitment to service and impact. Gary also understood that his work had helped create a new model for celebrity advocacy, one based on sustained commitment rather than occasional appearances. Other public figures had followed his example, dedicating significant portions of their time and resources to causes they cared deeply about. Gary's approach had shown that fame could be used as a tool for service rather than self-promotion, and that the most meaningful legacy a public figure could leave was not their body of work but their impact on real lives. The man who had once worried about keeping the lights on at Steppenwolf Theater had built something far more lasting than any stage production or movie performance. Gary Sinise had created a living legacy that would continue to serve military families long after his own involvement ended. The foundation had developed into a sustainable organization with strong leadership, diversified funding, and deep relationships throughout the military community. But perhaps Gary's greatest achievement was not the foundation itself, but the example he had set for others.
Gary had shown that it was possible to use success and platform for something larger than personal gain, and that authentic service required sustained commitment rather than occasional gestures. He had demonstrated that the most important roles anyone could play were not on stage or screen, but in real life, in service to others who had sacrificed for causes larger than themselves.
Lieutenant Dan Taylor had been a fictional character, but Gary Sinise had spent 30 years making that character's journey real through his own life and work. The wounded veteran who found purpose and redemption through service had become a template for Gary's own transformation from actor to advocate, from entertainer to servant leader. In living out Lieutenant Dan's story, Gary had created his own extraordinary American story, one that would inspire others to find their own ways to serve and make a difference in the world. The Chicago theater actor who had taken a role in a Tom Hanks movie had become something he never expected to be, a living example of how one person's commitment to service could change thousands of lives and create ripple effects that would extend far into the future.
Gary Sinise had found his life's true calling by following the path that Lieutenant Dan Taylor had shown him, and in doing so, he had created a legacy that would outlast any performance he had ever given on stage or screen.